Hi everybody, and welcome back to our Chapter 5 discussion on body composition in sport. So, we've talked so far about body size and shape, somatotypes, and some other important factors about the body size. So let's talk about body composition. So where does body fat hang out on your body? Where is our muscle mass? Things like that. So, very similar to measurements like body size and shape and somatotyping, when we assess body composition, we're trying to determine the physique of the athlete and monitor any modifications made in our training programs or diet to see if we're actually helping them improve their sports performance. However, there is kind of a downside to doing body composition testing because a lot of people can take body composition testing personally. So if we use body composition testing incorrectly, this can go from something that is very beneficial and helpful in giving us data about how we can better serve our athletes to a rather traumatic experience. So an example is when I was in college and I was an athlete, I was very interested in knowing what my body composition was. What was my body fat percentage? Well, now that I actually teach this, it makes sense why I was so interested. But they didn't want to do body composition assessments on women because, like a lot of places, they said, oh, body composition testing is going to make women have eating disorders. Well, if it's done wrong, people can get very self-conscious about their bodies and how it's formed and where they hold their body fat and things like that. So we do need to be careful about how we go about assessing body composition, but it is not inherently a bad thing. What is a bad thing is when we have coaches that set things like arbitrary cutoffs for body fat percentages, like everybody has to have 18% body fat or better. That's not very helpful. Or there's mandatory weight limits in a sport that isn't a weight classified sport. So body composition is helpful, but we need to be smart about it. And we also need to remember that body composition is just one factor of many that is going to influence sports performance, just like somatotyping and just like body size and weight. So what's going to actually impact body composition? Our four main factors are going to be genetics and lifestyle, growth, aging, and nutrition. So let's dig into each of these a little bit more. So looking at genetics and lifestyle factors, we know that body composition is going to be influenced by this really complex interaction between our genetics and the DNA in our bodies and the environmental factors that we interact with on a day-to-day basis, like our nutrition and our physical activity levels and lifestyle. We've had some inconsistent studies out there that show that genetic influence on obesity can be non-existent to accounting for almost 90% of our BMI. But realistically, we're probably looking at genetics playing a role of somewhere between 40 and 70% of our inherited BMI, so body size, body shape, and everything like this. And the reason for this is when we look at these predictions, we don't know if they're necessarily because we're looking at shared genetics or we're looking at a shared environment. So ethically, we can't just take a child and rip it away from its mother and have it grow up in another environment and then see if there is a genetic potential or things like that. There's not a very ethical way to study this. So we're going with a conservative 40 to 70%. Genetics definitely play a role in our body size, body shape, but they're not everything. So also, we don't really have a way to identify an athlete who may genetically struggle to lose weight or body fat. We just know that we can look at family history and make some decent predictions. So genetics has a role, but so does our environment. The next thing we need to pay attention to in body composition is growth. So particularly puberty. Puberty is a time of rapid change in the body size, body shape, body composition for both sexes. However, this timing is going to vary considerably between person to person and then between the sexes. So we know that women tend to mature earlier than boys, so women will mature faster. We also know that women carry more body fat percentage than men because of the need to provide for a child during pregnancy. So we know that there's change here. And then within individuals, this is going to be different. Everybody's in about a 2 to 3 year range for puberty to occur, obviously with outliers on either side. We also know that the differences in maturation between men and women and individuals is going to have an important implications for sporting ability. So in general, late maturation can be an advantage or disadvantage depending on the sport or the individual's sex. And we kind of talked about this last class. Also, there's a couple changes that are going to occur during growth. So first, let's talk about the adipose tissue, so the fat tissue. Typically, we're going to see a large increase in adipose tissue during the first year of life, and then during puberty. We need this additional fat for our increased energy demands of the body. There's a lot of growth going on. We need to have that energy available to go through these growth processes. Additionally, you're going to see an influx in adipose tissue following the adolescent growth spurt. We'll also see total adipose mass increases, particularly in females. Whereas with males, we don't really see a change after puberty unless there's some major environmental factors going on. We also know that there's a lot of body image issues going on during adolescence with all of this kind of fat mass coming on to support growth. Especially if you're working with youth athletes in kind of that late elementary school through middle school age group, sensitivity and compassion are going to be especially important. They're already very hormonal. Now their bodies have excess body fat and they're feeling awkward. Also, middle school is just kind of traumatizing in general. So lots of sensitivity and compassion for these athletes. The next tissue type is muscle tissue. So we know that muscle mass will increase from about 20% of the total body mass as a newborn to somewhere between 35% of total body mass by age 5. You will then have a secondary muscle tissue growth spurt during adolescence, and this is going to accompany increased activity and food consumption. We'll see this secondary muscle tissue growth spurt be even greater in males, and this is because testosterone is going to kind of rule the level of muscle mass developed. So we know after puberty, males tend to develop and maintain more muscle mass than females. Finally, the last tissue we're really concerned with is our bone tissue, particularly our bone mass. So we know that bone growth will be completed by early adulthood. So late 20s to early 30s is the end of bone growth. The last of the ossification of our long bones and short bones will be complete around this time. But bone tissue is going to continue to adapt across the lifespan. And this is going to change the width, the bone mineral density, and the internal infrastructure of bone. But the only way to improve our bone mass is to go through loading activities. So heavy weightlifting, impact loading, things like that. So even though our bones stop growing in early adulthood, they're not done developing, if that makes sense. Our next consideration is aging. So aging is going to impact the total amounts of adipose tissue. As we age, fat levels tend to increase in both men and women, usually starting in middle adulthood. Muscle mass starts to decline, fat mass starts to increase. We also know that skeletal muscle mass and bone mass are going to decline, but these results are reversible. So that means if I am participating in resistance training later in life, I can help kind of prevent or slow the progress of skeletal muscle mass and bone mass loss. This is also going to be particularly important to help mitigate and manage osteoporosis and osteopenia. So we can see here to the left, on the far left side, you have a picture of healthy bone infrastructure. And then on the right, you have bone that has gone through osteoporosis. So we can see that this bone mass has declined, the bone infrastructure has become brittle, and this is more prone to breakage and doesn't support the body as well. The next important thing with body composition is nutrition. So athletes, typically when you talk to them, they're either in the process of bulking up or trying to lose weight or cutting. Usually if this is going on, athletes really start to tighten up their nutrition one way or the other. Nutrition, there's a lot of debate out there whether it's just simply something as simple as the quantity of calories you're consuming or if the quantity and the quality of the calories matters. But for the most part, if you just kind of pay attention to energy balance, is what we can see on the top right here, you can gain or lose weight fairly easily. So we know that our body weight will be maintained if I can maintain an energy balance. So the energy that I consume equals the energy I expend. We know that body weight is gained, however, when I consume more calories than what I expend. And then weight is lost when I consume fewer calories than what I expend. So those are basic energy balance equations to pay attention to with nutrition. However, our energy expenditure is going to be made up of a couple different things. So the first primary one is going to be your basal metabolic rate. So this is the baseline level of calories your body burns to just exist. This is, I laid in bed all day and watched Netflix, I'm doing absolutely nothing amount of calories you need to consume. This is bare minimum. The next is the thermic effect of food. So it does take some energy to break down food for calories. And that's about 10% of what we consume. We have to, or 10% of the energy in our bodies is used to break down what we consume for energy. And then the final effect is going to be our physical activity. This accounts for anywhere between 5% of our calories burned to 25% of our calories burned. And this physical activity is also going to be very variable because the amount of calories you burn is going to be determined by the type of activity, the size of the athlete, the gender of the athlete, and the quantity of muscle. And these are all going to influence the energy expended during physical activity. So while nutrition is fairly simple as a concept, there are a lot of nuances to how it can impact our body composition. So now that we've kind of talked about body composition, why we measure it, why it's important, let's talk about how we actually assess it. So body composition assessment takes kind of two routes. I have things that I'm going to do in the field and things I'm going to do in the lab. So we have three kind of lab tests and three kind of field tests that we do. The lab tests are criterion or research methods. These include densiometry or underwater weighing, air displacement plethysmography, dual X-ray, anthropometry, or DEXA. Our field tests are going to include anthropometry and skin folds, BIA or bioelectrical impedance, and height and weight indexes, or what you're most familiar with, the BMI. Our first body composition assessment is going to be densiometry or underwater weighing. So the way this works is densiometry works off of the Archimedes principle. So basically, if you were to submerge something into water, the volume of water it displaces is going to be the same as the volume of the individual or the object. So this is going to be more important here in a second. And the Archimedes principle with densiometry is going to also assume that the body is divided into two compartments. There is going to be fat free mass and fat mass. So realistically, we know this is an oversimplified kind of model, but it works for the math we're about to do. Also, since we know that fat is the only constituent of the body that has a density that is less than water, fat mass is going to make the body float. So when I know the volume of the water that is displaced by the individual, and I know the weight of the individual, this is going to give me the density of the individual. And then the more fat mass an individual has, the less dense they will be. Therefore, we can figure out their body fat percentage from this. So when we're going to take densiometry measurements, we need to calculate that individual's total body mass and their volume, which we do by submerging them in water. And then we plug this information into an equation to calculate their total body density. Once we have their total body density, we're going to turn around and place this information into another equation. This is going to help us predict our total body fat percentages. This method used to be the gold standard. It is relatively accurate, but it is very uncomfortable for the subject because if you think about it, fat's supposed to make you float, but there's also compartments of the body that hold air that will also help you float, most notably your lungs and your GI tract. So you have to, when you're doing this process, you have to take a deep breath in and then blow all of the air out of your lungs as much as you can, and then submerge yourself. So if everybody were to try to take a deep breath in, blow it all out, and then just see how long you can sit comfortably with no air in your lungs. Now, yes, there is a little air left in your lungs. It's referred to as residual volume, but just see how long you can comfortably sit like that. It's not too long. And now I'm going to make you do that underwater. And now I'm going to make you do that underwater while sitting completely still. And the picture that I have right here, this person gets to do it in this really nice open pool. When I got to do it in college, it was like a reformatted shipping container. So now it was dark and claustrophobic, and I can't breathe, and I'm underwater. It's very uncomfortable for the subject. Also, you have to have skill as the subject to kind of minimize these errors of everything that could possibly go wrong with your hydrostatic weight and your residual lung volume. If you don't breathe out all the way, if you panic and hold your breath, if you panic and you move, there's just a lot of issues kind of with the assessment. It takes practice. They say you usually need somewhere between 5 and 10 really good measurements to get accurate body composition out of this. I've seen it take as many as 20 measurements, and that's a big burden on your subject. So while it works, it's fairly accurate. It can be kind of uncomfortable. Also, this can be really expensive because you need specialized equipment to do it. You need access to a pool or these specialized underwater weighing chambers, or you have to refit something like what I used, which is an old shipping container. It takes a lot of money to do this, so something to consider. Our next body composition assessment for the lab is air displacement plethysmography. The company that works with this mostly is CosMed and the Bod Pod. This works also using Archimedes' principle, and it's very similar to underwater weighing, but it's going to estimate your theoretical body volume instead of with water. It's using it with air pressure, which is so much more comfortable for the subject. So the subject is going to sit in this little spaceship-looking container that's divided into 2 different chambers, and each of them is going to have a known volume. And then we're going to have a computer unit that hooks into this. There's a diaphragm in the back of the machine that's going to fluctuate back and forth to change the air pressure. And then this is going to do some magical math calculations and give us the subject's body volume. This does have its issues as well. You are kind of in a sealed little spaceship, so some people can get claustrophobic. Also, if you don't breathe normally, you can mess up with the air pressure. And you also need to wear incredibly skin-tight clothing in order to make this work. So you have to wear a swimming cap. Gentlemen, they usually tell you to come in compression shorts or a Speedo. Ladies, you're either coming in a one-piece swimsuit or a sports bra and spandex shorts. So you need to be as smooth as possible when you're in there. This is much more comfortable. This is kind of the expectation for most of our research nowadays for body composition assessment. And it's also fairly accurate. But as I said, it does still have some sensitivity issues if a subject holds their breath or they're not wearing the appropriate clothing. Again, this is very expensive, specialized equipment, like $50,000 kind of expensive equipment in that range. So not everybody has access to this, even though it is really good for research. Our third and final body composition assessment in the lab is a DEXA scanner, or dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. I can never say that word, I apologize. Basically, DEXA is going to use dual photons in the gamma radiation spectrum, and it's going to kind of shoot at 2 different angles, and this is going to give us a measure of tissue composition. The really cool thing about DEXA is it can give you more than just body composition. It can tell you about bone mineral density, it can tell you about your fat-free mass, and it can give you your fat mass percentages. We can also break these scans down from a whole body assessment to each individual limb and torso. So we can know not only the body fat percentage of the whole body, but also where is the fat located. If you have a lot of fat around your internal organs, that's really unhealthy and can lead to a lot of things like cardiovascular disease. But if most of your fat is subcutaneous, that is actually more beneficial. DEXA in general is relatively comfortable. You basically lay down and you let yourself get scanned. The downside of this is you have to be absolutely still for extended periods of time, so that can be kind of uncomfortable for a subject in some aspects, and you are going to get exposed to some radiation. It's really no more than a commercial flight from New York to California, because you're dealing with radiation from the sun coming through into the cockpit and all that sort of stuff. But it is still radiation, and it is something to consider. Typically, DEXA scanners are only seen in the hospital setting because they are incredibly expensive pieces of equipment. But if you can get a hold of one of these, this truly is the gold standard for body composition assessment. So now we're going to move into our field tests. So probably what you are the most familiar with is the anthropometry and skin fold assessments. Basically, it's portable, it's really low expense, it's non-invasive. Everybody kind of has a general idea of what's going on. So you're going to typically with this assessment, you're going to do a skin fold measurement of somewhere between 3 and 7 sites. You're going to get some girth measurements, you're going to get some height, weight, and then if you're really being thorough, you'll get some limb length and bone breadths measurements. While these measurements are very popular, they're also prone to very high error rates, and that's usually because we have people that are not appropriately trained doing these, or we have inconsistencies between test administrators. So while we do have a skin fold assessment being done here in this picture, this is totally not up to protocol. There should be more pinching, and this is not a research grade skin fold caliper. So even though it's a pretty picture, this is not how we do this in real life. I will show you this in exercise physiology. And this is why we have errors. But basically, when we're doing this, it's also important to remember that the variety of physiques is going to make for differences in talented and skilled athletes. So when you're taking these assessments and you find that somebody may have a larger body, or let's say a waist circumference, you don't want to place judgment on that. It is just a collection of data that gives us information about their potential performance. So always take some care when assessing this data, because you could also be dealing with researcher error. The next, and what I usually recommend that people use if they're doing field analysis, is bioelectrical impedance, or BIA. Basically what this is going to do is it's going to send a small electrical current through the body, and it's going to take resistance measurements of that electrical current based on kind of the assumption that the different tissues in the body have different electrical properties. Tissues that are very high in body fluids are going to be highly conductive because of their electrolytes and water content. So things like muscle, organs, things like that. Whereas bone and fat don't have a ton of water content, so they're going to be more resistive. So basically, when we're going through this, we just assume that if the easier the current gets through the body with the electricity, the less body fat that individual has. Basically, we get our fat-free estimate after we normalize it for height. Then we take our fat mass is calculated by the fat-free mass minus the individual's total mass. BIA is typically inexpensive, it's easy to use, it requires very minimal training, it's comfortable for the subject, it's very portable. However, BIA, like everything else, can be influenced by some things, particularly diet, hydration, ethnicity, and electrolyte balance. So we, again, even though this is really easy, it's kind of foolproof, we need to take some care in how we assess this data. And then finally, this is kind of the easiest thing to do is get somebody's BMI, do a height and weight index. This has been used for a long, long time as a method to kind of determine somebody's ideal weight. However, the BMI was never intended to try to forecast an individual's ideal weight. That's not how BMI works. Height and weight indexes in the BMI are great for estimating a population's health characteristics. It was never intended to come down to the individual level for health characteristics. And that's because it does not tell us anything about the individual's body composition or their body structure. It just tells us a relationship between their body weight and their height. So if you look at the top picture over here, we have two individuals that are 6 foot tall and weigh 250 pounds with a BMI of 33.9. If you have a BMI of 33.9, you are considered obese. Well, looking at these pictures, one of these individuals is a sumo wrestler, the other one is a bodybuilder. Which one do you think would have more associated comorbidities and health problems? All right? The BMI doesn't tell us anything about that. It just gives us a number. So while it is great for a screening tool, it is not something you want to use as your only level of assessment. As we said, it's inexpensive and reliable, especially if I'm doing population-based epidemiological research. but it's not ideal for the athletic population. It's not ideal for looking at an individual and saying you need to weigh this much. Additionally, because athletes tend to weigh more and they also tend to have more muscle mass, in general, they tend to be overclassified as overweight and obese due to just the larger amounts of muscle mass than the general public. So BMI, helpful tool for the population, used very carefully for independent individuals. So finally, the last thing I want to talk about is how does this body composition relate to sports performance? So we know body composition for certain sports is going to be linked with performance. And there are some sports that are especially intolerant or more tolerant to body composition diversity. So if I have a sport where body weight must be transported, so think like running or jumping, a lean physique with a low body fat percentage is going to be advantageous. However, in team sports, your sport position tends to determine your ideal body composition rather than the sport itself. Additionally, if you have a sport that requires a weight class, things like wrestling and powerlifting, this may place pressures on athletes to maintain an abnormally low body composition and low body weights and low body fat percentages. So when we look at the sport, we need to kind of be careful. Also, we want to use caution, as I've said several times throughout this presentation, when using body composition to determine sports performance, because there is great variation in our data collection methods. So it's not fair to compare somebody's skin fold assessment to a DEXA assessment, even though both pieces of information are helpful. We also want to be aware of our data collection accuracy and the variety of available phenotypes for a particular sport, which is why I give you this picture below. These women right here are all Olympic athletes. None of them have the same body type, body build, somatotype, or body composition, but yet they're all Olympians. These are all kind of your elite class athletes. So when it comes to body composition, take it with a grain of salt. All right. Thank you guys so much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing back from you guys for Chapter 6. Bye.